Hello, it's Czech Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Geneva Skeen, an artist usually based in Los Angeles. She's released works on Room 40, Dragon's Eye, Touch. Her most recent long-form work, Turning of the Day, was released on the fabulous Line imprint. And as we discuss at the beginning of the show, it's a work designed to be listened to at half attention. Geneva's work has so much, to my ears anyway, awareness of the listening body and the presence of the listener, what they bring to the experience of listening. There's so much ambiguity with what she puts forward sonically that explodes in all kinds of potential directions in the listener's head. On Turning of the Day, there's a sound that resembles almost exactly this draft that we often get in my house on windy days that creates this kind of low revving, humming sound as it kind of rattles and vibrates the door frame. There's a sound on Turning of the Day that reminds me of that. It sounds, like I say, like a motor revving. It almost sounds like something more sinister at points. There's a sense that it's more than itself. And that's the thing with Geneva's music. There's sounds that project outward in all directions. They're more than what is presented, partly because of what Geneva is putting in and partly because of what the listener is pulling down. And she's great to talk to. She's picked 3 awesome records. I loved hearing her talk about them. I think you will too. You can head over to genevaskeen.com for more information on Geneva and to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for all those usual links. Thank you for the lovely feedback on the show as always. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy this one too. This is Geneva Skeen on Crucial Listening. Hello, Geneva. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for coming on. So you're here to talk about 3 important albums. Before we get stuck into those, I wanted to ask about your new release online, Turning of the Day, which on the record description mentions it's a challenging long-form work in 2 parts meant to be listened to in full, but at half attention. Now, half attention, I think, is such an interesting and provocative phrase in all kinds of directions. I want to know, to begin with, why it appealed to you to work with the idea of half attention in listening.
That's a great question. I think that listening attention is a special kind of attention, and it is boundless in a way. You know, our day-to-day listening as it relates to functioning and perception is quite muted compared to what our listening capacity is. And a lot of my work is interested in what is the sort of boundary between being overwhelmed by sensation and listening and being out of touch with the world around you, and the pleasure that can be found in being overwhelmed as much as there is also a kind of repulsion in being overwhelmed. So half attention is a very subjective request of a listener. It asks them to be aware of themselves as they're listening in a way that, like, just telling someone to listen to a record could mean anything. Like, people listen to music in all different kinds of ways. And so it asks sort of preemptively someone to think about their attentiveness to listening. And then it says, okay, dial that back to some level of like less than what you think it is. But I realize now it's a kind of conundrum that I've asked someone to pay attention to something and then to kind of halfway ignore it.
Yeah.
But I like that paradox. I think that, this record can be overwhelming in its tension and quietness to an extent. So on one hand, I'm sort of letting the listener off the hook to let their mind kind of free associate or do whatever. Like, I don't care if you're writing an email, not really, but like you're gonna eventually come back to it if you know that you're at half attention. And then I think the last thing I'll say about it is that I struggle with the genre and word ambient, especially as I feel it has kind of become a catch-all that includes a variety of different sounds with a variety of different intentions from the composer's perspective. And yet the sort of shorthand understanding of ambient seems to nudge its way into like calm music or like lo-fi beats to study to, or 60 cycle hum and things to zone out to completely, or that will be some kind of balm or salve or curative for a very challenging world. And I don't try to make work that is a balm or a curative for a challenging world. I actively seek to point to that in the work, or at least point to a listener's perception of their own, I don't want to necessarily just say anxiety, but like pointing to the things that are real, that are not just safe, that are safe but also not safe, or things that are encroaching, things that are impending, things that have happened, things that are happening. It's meant to, the phrase half attention is meant to sort of shake you out of the ambient category and instead think about being active and not passive. I don't care if you lie on the floor and listen to it. It might be kind of nice if you have a subwoofer, but like you're still putting your attention actively and not just letting the thing wash over you, or perhaps you're oscillating between letting the thing wash over you and then crawling into the sound, kind of. So yeah.
Nice. Another section of that description actually says that it's written, and this is expanding on what you've just said as well, but it's written for interstitial time, written for dawn, the small hours in which we churn on thoughts, the graveyard shifts of our minds. How do you compose for that? I mean, how is that reflected in the way that you approach putting this music together?
Well, there's a literal kind of component to it, which is I was invited by someone in South Korea like several years ago to make a piece for this global like 24-hour online piece that was never actualized, but he was assigning different times of day, like half-hour slots to people to compose for, and then in theory this piece would play 24 hours a day online, and whatever time slot your personal computer's clock was at would sync up with the time slot that was, that the composer had composed for. And I chose 11:30 p.m. to midnight because I think I like really, again, exploring this idea of anticipation, of impending change, of being sort of heightened in my awareness of something coming. And so I kind of sort of started to sketch out this piece back then for half an hour. And I think the album is still exactly half an hour. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, it's meant to trace the sort of moments of watching a clock, knowing that something is changing, knowing that something somewhat arbitrary is changing, but like that in your psyche, it is still real. Like it's no longer today. It's now today, or it's no longer, you know, there's this switch that happens kind of. So that's kind of how this project started, and I think tonally it reflects that sort of long temporal slowness that happens when you start paying attention to the time. Like, I don't know if you meditate, but like when you start meditating or early in your meditation practice, time becomes super slippery, and you're like, you set a timer for 5 minutes and that meditation goes really quickly, but then you try ramping up and you set a timer for 10 minutes and you're like, oh my God, this is forever. This is forever. And that is a very real feeling, and it's an uncomfortable feeling. But it is like opening up a kind of internal psychic expanse of going back and forth, oscillating again between being aware of feeling uncomfortable, that discomfort disappearing or dissipating, and then circling back around again. And it has this like cycle of like, okay, no. And then, you know, part 2 of that record is a kind of a release from that, where something starts to happen and you're like, oh, okay, it's today now. But the cycle comes back in a different form. Repetition comes back in a different form, and that's sort of just the banality of time passing, I guess, when your attention is only really on that. And it also reflects, I think, tonally, the kinds of feelings that you have, or at least I have, when I can't sleep. And I'm just like, I want to be asleep. I'm trying to sleep. My mind is cycling or racing or getting stuck on banal things that actually don't matter but are a stand-in for something that probably does matter that I'm trying not to pay attention to. And so I composing for that, technically speaking, is about really like taking sounds that I have from my house at that hour, taking sounds from like my own body, my own breath during those hours, and then really like pulling them apart. In their component parts, I would like pull them out and stretch them, but then I would compile them and then stretch that out again and then pull it out again, stretch the parts again. So it's sort of like taffy pulling in a way.
One thing that I think is most pronounced for me in listening to this is the use of low frequencies. I think when I think of something which deals with those interstitial periods, often in other pieces that I've heard when dealing with those kind of I don't know, like semi states, is like traces of sound and things kind of wisps at the edges. The low frequencies are really amazing because they feel like a real weight dragging at the base or anchoring this throughout the entire thing. Tell me, this is a super vague question. Tell me about the use of low frequencies in this piece, because they feel like at many points, and depends where my concentration is, but at many points they're the thing that I think I'm paying the most attention to consciously when I'm listening.
Well, actually, can I ask you a question before I answer that, because I'm curious. That's where your attention focuses. How have you listened to this work, like on headphones or speakers, and how has that changed your attention to those low frequencies?
Oh, that's interesting. I listened once in my studio where I am currently, which is in the garden. It's like a little hut, which is very separate from the house and feels very private. And I listened over like reference headphones, and that felt very... That's I also, as well, you got the fact that I think that was the first time I listened to it and became extremely aware instantly, because that's the first time I'd encountered it. On the second time, I was in my living room which tends to be like a space of slightly more vigilance, because my boy was asleep. I'm always aware of the fact that because he's a light sleeper, I might need to go tend to him. I was hearing the bass frequencies, but through headphones, which are perhaps a little bit more pronounced in their transmission of bass frequencies. I think they felt more... There's an energy that I got from them when I was listening to them in the house, which was slightly darker, I think, than in the privacy of the shepherd's hut. And I don't know what that is. Could it be more shadows on the wall in my living room, which I was ingesting passively without realizing it, and kind of swirling that into what I was listening to? It's an incredibly
interesting
vague answer to your question, but yeah, it's interesting to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you listened on headphones and that you still felt a shift in tone. And to go back to your question, but I'll come back to what you were saying, and maybe speak about why I ask you that question, is like low frequencies to me, well, listening to me is a full body experience. I think that I talk a lot about deprioritizing the I, because I think that the I is associated with reading in a way that works with linear time, that is sort of held in a kind of supremacy, and I don't think it's necessarily all of the ways in which we experience time, and it's certainly not the way other cultures have documented time or spoken about time or conceptualized time. So we live in a sort of very visually dominated culture, and reading and language is really the primary way that we operate information as it is read through the eye. And so I'm looking for ways to put people... I'm looking for ways to put myself back in my body, and looking for ways in which I can listen more fully with all of the capacity that my body has, that I have never trained or was never trained in, or it's just this latent capacity that isn't necessary most of the time in day-to-day life in the 21st century. We're in the 21st century. And so low frequencies is really kind of an obvious way, I think, to get me there. I really associate higher frequencies with the cerebral, with being in the head, and being with low frequencies. I guess that's also why I asked how you listened, if it was on headphones or on monitors, because with monitors, you will get like a vibrating of your desk or your chair or the wall or the floor if you're listening to this record with decent enough bass response speakers. And it's so interesting, like listening with headphones, I feel like you might get more of a sense of pressure. And pressure, as opposed to vibration, is a different kind of sensation. Pressure is kind of what we do to distract ourselves from pain. Like if you get a cut, you put pressure on it because your nervous system can really only feel one sensation at a time. And so one of the reasons, among many, that you do that is to distract yourself from the pain of having severed a nerve or whatever. And so getting pressure around your head especially, or even in your chest, which is quite close to your head, I imagine might exacerbate the kind of anxiety that you mentioned or darkness that you mentioned you felt. And, there's a ton of different contexts happening. Like you're more vigilant because you're thinking about your kid, and there's shadows, and you're not in a garden, and you're not by yourself. And So like all of those contexts, all of those situations are super interesting to me. And that's the weird thing about releasing an album, is you just sort of let it out into the world, and like people are going to listen to it however they're going to listen to it. And if you're lucky enough to have people listen to things multiple times, it's going to shift in this like very chemical way. But yeah, low frequencies I really love. And I think some people have very different relationships to low frequencies. I think some people are very, are given a kind of anxiety about low frequencies, and somehow find high frequencies to be more, maybe not soothing, but legible. And maybe that has to do with the sort of reading thing or the cerebral thing. But for me, it's definitely like, low frequencies, I want to put my body all over the wall, or like I want to touch everything that is happening, and really hear the sound through my skin, and hear the sound through the room that I'm in, hear the room respond to the frequencies. Like there's just a lot of tactile capacity that's opened up in low frequencies, which we don't always get. Speaking, the human voice doesn't dip into the low frequencies that we have the capacity to hear, either orally or hear physically, through skin. So voice always kind of cuts across low frequencies or bass music in a way that I also think is really interesting. You can talk over like a bass set and still kind of understand someone in a way that like you're not going to be able to talk through a noise show, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember hearing my own nasal breathing and those around me during a Thomas Kona set, which was like all notched out, at high frequencies, which is amazing. Geneva, this release is really cool. I need to listen to it over speakers, clearly, so when I get a chance to crank it to the point where things might fall off tables, I'll absolutely be doing that, and people should definitely check it out too. It's on Line, right? It's on the Line Bandcamp.
Yes,
probably a good
Line
place to go.
Imprint.
Line Imprint, excellent. Great. Well, Geneva, let's talk about your important records. You've picked 3 as per the instruction, and one question I like to ask is about how you contemplated the word important when coming to your list. So was there a way that you understood that word, or a place you took it in order to come up with the selection that you did?
Oh gosh, yes. There certainly is, and I kind of struggled with it for a while, to be quite honest. And it's like asking someone what their favorite color is. If they you're like, well, it depends, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
But my train of thought went important for the audience that reads this blog that might listen to my music, ? No, don't do that. Important for who I am as a musician, ? Okay, maybe like important to me as a person, as like a woman, as someone who grew up the way I grew up. Okay, maybe like think about that. Important for like me as an academic. I don't know. So I went a lot of different directions with this, and I just made a really long list, to be honest. And then I started editing it down.
Nice.
Yeah, I had to do some editing, and that's kind of how I function a lot of the times these days. I just sort of give up on editing before I do the thing. I just start with doing the thing and then editing. So
I think that's a great idea. At least you get rolling. You haven't got the paralysis of like, well, I must come to 3, in an immaculate form before I don't know. It's quite an intimidating foot to put forward, right?
It really is intimidating. So good on you for
God.
But ultimately, I was like, oh, this is actually an interesting combination of things that I feel like represents me well in all of these facets. And it could have been a couple of different other combinations of things, but I sort of settled on this combination because I was like, this is definitely where I'm at now, and it also, I feel like, holds the longest lasting representation of me in the past maybe like 5 years.
Great answers. So let's go with whichever one you want to talk about first. Have you got a preference?
Yeah, why don't we go from most cerebral to least cerebral in a way. Oh, now I regret saying that because
I was looking at the list like,
I feel like I've miscategorized. Let's go in the way that I think we should go. Let's start with music of the Cash.
Nice. Okay, awesome. So Ursula K. Le Guin and Todd Barton. So why is this one important to you?
This is important to me because it is so thorough in its consideration of world building. It is so believable in its fantasy, or maybe not fantasy, but in its speculative fiction. It's so considered in terms of building a world that is plausible and timeless and not appropriative, but based in real history, real life, real things that have happened on Earth. And I think she does specify that the Cash live on Earth, I believe. And I know that most of the recordings are taken from Marin County. But there is, it's so successful in its, and I don't mean timelessness in a sort of classic kind of way, like an icon kind of way. It feels without time. It's atemporal. It feels like, it could totally be 5,000 years from now, or this could have been 5,000 years ago, or it could honestly be right now somewhere. And it's remarkable. It was made in the 80s. The reissue is it sounds wonderful. It sounds maybe like it was made in the 80s, but that doesn't really matter in the work. The work really just stands on its own in its own world. And I'm so impressed by the audio world that's created. It's so multidimensional, and I admit I have not read Always Coming Home, the book that it is based off of. I flipped through it, but it is gargantuan book. Yes. It is so rich. It is as rich as the physical reissue is. I have the physical reissue on vinyl, and it has so many fun things in it, this amazing bookmark and these fold outs and illustrations and Ursula Le Guin, a true collaborator,
right.
Really, really special release. I can't think of a whole lot of things like this.
No, for sure. Do you get the alphabet and the the vocabulary in that physical reissue as well?
You get some, I believe. I wanted to look at it, but I don't have it with me here in New York. I have it at home in LA, and so I was trying to look at photographs, but I can't remember if you get the alphabet. But I did read a funny anecdote about the alphabet, is that she was already working she was already working with Todd Barton on the recording for the cassette, the original cassette, which was just strapped to the book. Talk about excess and baroque kind of production values. And at some point they were talking about the instruments and they were talking about the songs, and Todd Barton was like, "Do the Cash speak English?" And she just goes, "Dang it." And she disappears for another 3 months to develop an alphabet and develop a whole
wow.
codex and language. And so, I don't know, to me this is Tolkien can take a back seat. Yeah. I think
I was just thinking, yeah. Wow.
I also love that she wanted to make an album of their songs, but like somehow the language part was like the last thought she had. Like,
yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Like it was so real for her, I think, maybe. That actually figuring out what the language was like, oh, I already know what the language is. Oh no, of course I have to transcribe this and like document it and develop it. So yeah, absolutely. Do you remember how you first came to discover this record? I bought it from Pete Swanson at a record swap.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, it was a record swap at Zebulon, I think 2018. Yeah, 2018. Maybe late 2017. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I was at Zebulon in Los Angeles, in Atwater Village, and I went to a record swap, and I was talking to Richard Chartier, actually, who released Turning of the Day. And he was posted up next to Pete Swanson, and I was spending money like I don't care, and I just saw like the name Le Guin peeking out of a corner of the stack, and I was like, say what?
Yeah.
And I pull it up, and it's just like Music of the Cash. What? But like Ursula Le Guin made a record. What?
Right.
I didn't know who Todd Barton was at the time, and I like look at the back, and it's got all of this like amazing text and didactic. And as an undergrad, I studied critical theory, and I did some ethnography projects, and I was like, oh, hell yeah, this is going to be cool. And I just bought it. I didn't know really anything about it. And then I got home and I opened it, and it was just like Christmas time. I was like, oh my God, there's so many things in here. Like, woo.
Yeah.
I listen to it quite often.
I think this is always an unfair question to ask about an important record, because I'm sure the answer is all of it. But if you think back to the record now, what are some particularly protrusive moments that come to mind just as we're talking that are like, oh, that's awesome, I love that?
I love the flow of it overall. It feels ethnographic in terms of like the time that you're spending with each track, in terms of the space that's created and the world that's created. So the recordings of crickets, like fire crackling, storytelling. You hear a conversation between presumably a woman's voice and presumably a man's voice. And then, you establish this sense of community and your presence, like as a witness in this community. And then it launches into Long Song, I think is the track name. And that is it's just gorgeous. It is just like a hauntingly gorgeous track with all of these vocal layers and shifting keys and long singing. That's what it's called. It's track 8. Long singing. And it's just like you get launched into another layer of the world that you've been invited into, and it feels kind of transcendent and really special. I just think the flow is really remarkable.
Yeah. I think what surprised me about this, because I kind of read about it first and then listened, was the presence of something which I guess resembles a more organized and premeditated music than I was expecting. There's one track that's almost got like a trip-hoppy beat going through it, which I don't know I was ready for, but it was really, really interesting. And then as I pondered it, I was like, well, yeah, why not? Like, why can't this community be producing something like this? I mean, do the more overtly musical sections like that resonate with you as well?
Yeah, I think it like really lends itself to the atemporality of it. Like, yeah, like you're saying, like, why not? It could be in the future. Maybe trip hop already happened. Like in the 21st century, we certainly reference, music that was very old or, 500 years ago, sure, but like also older than that. And Gregorian chant gets sampled in trip hop. I mean, like this crossover of time that happens in music where things are identifiable, but you can always make a cover too, right? Like you could cover a Gregorian chant and make it today. I mean, what's to stop you? And yeah, I think that like it's interestingly blended. I also love like the quality of certain sounds, like the snapping and clapping in, I forget which track, I think it's in the first half, where it's just women singing that sort of devolves into laughter. I'm like so curious about how those elements were recorded, the human elements that were recorded, because it's got to be indicative to a certain extent of the recording equipment. But also it's like, those are snaps. I can tell those are snaps, but like those don't sound like snaps in the real world. And they certainly don't sound like snaps as they're recorded now. But I guess I'd have to go look into 1985 recordings of snaps. Right. I don't know, like what choices were made in mixing this that she directed, I guess is a really, that's a question for Todd probably. But
yeah. And speaking of Ursula as well, what's your relationship like with her output generally? Have you read many of her books, or, you know, was this an initiation, or?
It's not an initiation for sure. I am super ashamed to admit I have read very few Ursula Le Guin books.
Yeah, same.
I read, what is the one that I'm thinking of that it's about this sort of like dream time. There's an apocalyptic event. The main protagonist is a guy. The Lathe of Heaven.
Okay.
I read The Lathe of Heaven, and I love The Lathe of Heaven, and I love dream work, and I love the sort of like loss of reality that happens. I never read Tales from Earthsea, but I am familiar with her sort of personhood.
Yes.
And her investment in feminism, and her investment in environmentalism, and her real belief in a sustainable world that is trying to move against capitalism and consumerism and constant obsessive technologies, I think she says, and presence and listening. And her relationship to gender, I think, is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, she's a real badass, and so I love her. And I am ashamed to say that, like, I'm actually not super deeply familiar with all of her work, but she lives as a figure rent-free in my head, as they say.
Yeah. No, same here. I've read The Dispossessed and absolutely loved it last year, and but that's it. And this is definitely a nice nudge for me to pick up that thread again.
Yeah.
If we were going to play a little snippet of one of these tracks now, do you have a preference? Something that might give a little bit of insight?
I mean, Long Singing is my favorite track on this record, and I love voice. I love using voice. I love using multiple voices. I have a choir background, so so yeah, that one is definitely my favorite.
Okay, Geneva, let's go to your second important record. So again, if you give me the name of it and then a bit about why it's important to you as well.
Okay, this is such a like small release thing. I guess the name of it is Vessel, but I always think of it in my head as the Roy Montgomery Grouper Split EP. Yes,
yeah. I'm not sure on the answer to that either, and I don't think there's even a clear answer online.
Yeah, and like I had it on my like Discogs want list for forever, and I'm not a Discogs person. This is a disclaimer. Like, this is maybe the second thing I ever bought on Discogs out of maybe 4 things.
Right.
And I really wanted this. And I have a slight object fetish. I have a record collection, but like there's something about this thing that I just really wanted to have closer to me than freaking YouTube. And I wanted to carry it around with me. And so, yeah, I have one of the copies I think I bought on either Discogs, maybe it was eBay, who knows. Any case, I sought it out really aggressively, which is unusual for me. It is so beautiful. Like, it's just so beautiful. I love Roy Montgomery's work. I love, like, Jaguar Ma. I like his stuff from the 80s. And Grouper, I mean, duh. Like,
right, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
What's there to say about that without me sounding obvious or cliche? But like, I love Grouper. It's beautiful. Like, that shit makes me cry.
Right, yeah.
In a good way. And this record, I love the pairing of the two of them. I don't know who initiated it. I love that they didn't collaborate. They were just like, I'll do one side and you do the other side, and that will be enough.
Yeah.
And it still feels like a collaboration. It feels like a conversation between sides A and B.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's obviously some nice overlap in terms of sound and timbre and tone, mood between the two of them. They both work in this kind of like surging tempo where things like pick up and then they do like fade a little bit, and then they pick up and they fade. They both have these cycles that are ebbing and flowing. They're very watery, but they're also, I guess a couple of the tracks probably have time signatures if you wanted to transpose it, but it also makes Roy Montgomery's works on this record make me think of Satie in terms of the like composer's choice in a way. Like, it's time to move forward, it's time to slow down. He feels like he's really, or rather his guitar feels like really an important part of his body. Mm-hmm. They both really take advantage of their equipment, their gear, to make a really specific signature sound in different ways. But like, I love how bassed up and trebled down the first track is on the Roy Montgomery side. And yeah, Pressed Bloom is a heartbreaking track of beauty. I was listening to it the other day, actually, in prep for this, and I was taking a walk around where I am in the Hudson Valley, kind of almost sunset, and like these clouds of gnats were like dancing in the sunlight, like in tandem with the music, and I was just like transported. And then I was walking around listening to Pressed Bloom and just like smelling these flowers, these magnolias and these blossoms, and in the humidity, it's just so perfumed. And it's a really synesthetic record, I think, for me. It's very perfumed.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You may have already answered this. I mean, I wasn't really familiar with Roy Montgomery when this came out, but I was very into Grouper. And so in my head, this got immortalized as just a Grouper EP. Roy, but I completely, like, in memory, completely disregarded his side. I'd not actually sat and listened to it until now. It's amazing to hear both sides in company and responding and reflecting to each other, as you've said. What do you think the two sides gain from being in each other's company? Like, they could have, I guess, easily come out as two standalone things, but what is it about this response between them that maybe gives them an additional something?
Yeah, cool question. I don't know. Maybe it's like reading a full staff, like a full musical staff. I feel like Roy Montgomery's part of it really, even with everything I just said about like no time signature, I feel like the drone and the like the particular strike of his strumming sets up a kind of foundation and a structure that grouper sits in the treble clef, right? And I don't mean this in terms of I don't mean this in terms of frequency or pitch or key. I mean it in terms of like a full orchestral arrangement, kind of like together. Even though they're not listening to them simultaneously, it feels much fuller because there's this structure that can be set up. Or if you listen to side B first, or I don't even know whose side is whose. Like, it's so complementary. It's very yin yang. It's very like grouper fills in all of this structure with these washes and this cassette tape decay, and her voice that's delayed out to oblivion fills in these these pockets that Roy sets up in the strumming of his like sort of raga-esque guitar drones, and I just think it's like such a cute pairing, and it's an effective pairing, and like it just makes me happy in like a weird way, because there's so many like sort of like I said, heartbreaking moments on this record where they really pull at heartstrings, but it just really makes it so balanced. It makes me really content.
The one track that came right rushing back for me was Hold the Way, and I realized I know that track really, really well, even though I've not heard it in like 8 years, which is always a nice sign, right? When something just unpacks a box in your head and it's like, oh, here you go. But the kind of chorus section of that one is where she's just doing an R, forgoes anything.
Oh my
it's
God.
Absolutely exquisite. It's like, amazing. I absolutely love it. It's gorgeous. It's like a really real present feeling. It's lacking melodrama. It's very, very human. Both sides. Yeah, totally. So you mentioned that you were into Roy's work in the 80s. You had some background with Roy. I'm intrigued as to if you remember how you came into both of these artists. Like, how did you discover Roy's work? How did you discover Liz's work?
Oh, okay. Good question. So Roy's work came to me through a colleague of mine, a friend of mine in Los Angeles. I'm part of this collective called Volume. And my friend and co-collective member, I guess, colleague, Jared Baxter, put it on a playlist or on a mix for... we used to have a regular show on K-Chung, which was like a very local AM, originally pirate radio station in Los Angeles in Chinatown. And I just heard it and I was like, dude, what's this? And he was like, oh yeah, you should check out Roy Montgomery. He's from New Zealand. I mean, to me, like, I found Temple 4, which is a release on Cranky, I guess in the 90s, actually. Yeah, why did I say 80s? I don't know. Time, obviously, if there's a running theme today, it's that time is kind of like weird to me. So anyway, Temple 4 came out on Cranky in 96. I listened to it, and it's just like such a big listen, and yet it's really simply composed in terms of instrumentation. I don't know. In my head, like, Roy Montgomery was this like huge, epic figure, and I think he is, and I think his work is so cool, and I was so happy when there was like a big release of a bunch of work of his a couple years ago. But at the same time, I'm like, I followed Roy Montgomery on Instagram, and he followed me back, and I was like, what?
All right.
But like. Dada Ma is such a cool track, and everything on Temple 4 is really awesome, and I don't know, it's kind of present for me. It's I like guitars. I'm not good at guitar, so I feel like in my head I play guitar kind of like that with altered tunings.
Yeah.
I'm not good at like playing music, even though I had probably decades worth of lessons in me, and like I've never been good at playing music, so I just like look at an instrument and like find out what sounds it makes. That's kind of how I play guitar. Is I just like find a fun tuning and then use it as a percussive instrument, almost like or as a drone instrument that has two instruments within it. And grouper, I feel like must have come to me around the same time. I definitely had heard of her before Clearing. Is that the record? Ruins. Okay, 2014 Ruins.
Yeah.
That's the record. That was the first like real record that I sat with. But I knew about like Dragging a Dead Deer Up the Hill and Heavy Water and things like this. But Ruins really got me hooked. And then I started going through the back catalog. I don't know. It's like a kind of austere, neutral, powerful femininity that I hear in Grouper's work. Not to, bang on this some more, but there's like really kind of atemporality. I like decay, how it happens in her work in tandem with the liveness of her voice, which simultaneously then like decays immediately. Place is always really palpable for me in her records. Like it sounds like the Northwest. It sounds wet. She uses field recordings on Ruins a lot, and I think she recorded that one in Portugal on a residency, and it sounds like summer, and it sounds but like a cold summer. And I think that's like I think it's kind of not to reduce it, but I think it's a breakup record, and it totally sounds like that too. And what it's like being alone in the summer and the rain, and it's just sort of like I'm with myself. Okay, I'm with myself. Yeah, and she's awesome. I've been in her proximity a couple of times, and I always fangirl and get quiet and stupid and never say anything. But I've had dreams where I get to play a show in Portland, and like Grouper's there, and she's like, "Hey, just come play in my garage," and I'm like, "Okay." So she holds a psychic presence.
Have you seen her play live?
Yes, I saw her play live for an ambient church thing. Winter 2018. It was in a big Gothic cathedral in Los Angeles. There's like one or two of those, and she was playing. It was December. It was like right before Christmas, and she was playing appropriately for that time period, and it was super quiet. Super quiet. Really trying to use the reverb of the room. It was such a delicate performance, which struck me in relationship to the heaviness of her music. This felt like, if she had like a harp string, this was the performance where she's playing like the top single harp string. It was very reverent, and I don't say that just because it was in a church. I think you had to lean in to hear. You really talk about like really having to pay attention. It was good. Yeah.
Well, Geneva, let's go to your final important record.
Okay.
If you give me the name of it and then a bit about why it's important, let's do it.
I chose Swans, The Great Annihilator. I had to figure out a way to work in something crushing and aggressive into this selection, because that's a big thing for me to balance, in some ways, like the headiness of some of the things that I'm trying to do. Also, when I use my voice, like I'm trying to, I have a pretty decent range, but I end up singing in a pretty like mezzo-soprano range, and so I try to balance that with some crushing stuff. And my sense of crushing stuff comes from Swans. It is like the loudest shit I've ever heard. I love, I mean, if there's one place I'm going to be willing to blow my eardrums out, it's going to be a Swan show. It just, I'm going to look back on this in 20 years and regret it, but maybe I won't. I don't know. I love, it's a place, talk about like being really physically present in the music. Seeing a Swan show live is like my whole body vibrates. I'm like laughing at Michael Jarrah, like writhing like a snake, sweating, and then I'm like laughing at watching what's his name, Olaf, I think, playing the pedal steel, chewing gum like a maniac. And then I'm like feeling this aggression in my chest, which is really present, this sort of anger that has nowhere to go, like this sort of impotent anger that can only be expressed through entering a trancey state. And Great Annihilator I chose specifically because Jarbo is still in it, and her presence on that record is my favorite one. Her vocal range, it really goes into a lot of directions. Like it's Diamanda Galas in certain tracks, and then it's like really her sort of diva jazz background training in another track. Everybody's lending themselves to the tone of each song as fully as they can, as expressively as they can. There's so much color happening in this wall of blackness and grayness. And I love the album artwork. I love Mind, Body, Light, Sound. It's sort of ecstasy that it reaches. It's a huge record. I mean, I think a lot of people criticize it maybe because it's not as cathartic and chaotic and aggressive as like Filth or earlier Swan stuff. But like this line between, you know, accessible as far as Swans is ever going to be accessible to a broad audience, and still like agitated and heavy and crushing. I think they really, it's like chef's kiss. If this is a podcast, but I'm doing chef's kiss right now. Yeah. It's a good one.
Yeah, I feel like because this is like the penultimate one, right before they stopped for a long while. I hope that's right. But Soundtracks for the Blind, oh gosh, I hope that's correct, was the one I think that came out after this, which was basically a huge purging, it seemed, of the excess energy that they needed to get rid of in order to shut that project down for a bit. Yeah. So this kind of feels like to me the point at which that they were very aligned and had reached a point of like assimilating a lot of what had really characterized what they were doing. You know, it's interesting that it would be kind of criticized for not being as brutal as Filth or something, when it's like, well, they've done that. You know, they've been as brutal as Filth, very much on Filth. This feels like a very streamlined iteration of Swans, right? Like before they say, okay, we've kind of nailed being Swans, so let's park it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I appreciate about the project, is that it has, you know, it keeps reincarnating itself, and it knows. It's debatable, I guess, but like for the most part, Jarrah knows when to shift attention, shift directions, knows when enough is enough, knows like has a sense for pushing into extreme and excess, and when that excess is no longer effective, because excess is extremely effective when it still feels excessive, but when you are fully dissociated and numb, it's no longer excess anymore, it's no longer effective anymore. And like the project feels so tight and so clean. It's a long record.
It is,
and you get, each track is quite discreet and like really fully formed. It feels like it feels like I don't need it to be Filth. I don't need it to be as noisy and as aggressive, because it's been refined in a
in a positive way for me. Like, it's been given more dynamic borders that allow it to still be filthy, but also kind of surreptitiously can get under the skin of like your average like FM rock listener, and then they discover what it's about and they're like, oh, God damn it.
Yes. Do you remember how you discovered swans?
I knew about swans in high school. I mean, I went to high school in the early aughts. I graduated high school in the 2005. I knew about swans in high school. I knew I loved the Filth cover, but I knew that I couldn't at the time like really sit with that harsh of a noise. Mm-hmm. I felt it so deeply, like in my body and in my sort of mind at the time in high school, that I actually couldn't do the sort of homeopathic like is like thing that I think a lot of people who are attracted to aggressive music and noise music do, or they see themselves in the sound. I couldn't see, I didn't want to see the sound as it lived in me already. Like, I just wanted to not feel that anymore.
Yeah, totally.
And so I knew about it and I was into it, and I knew that like I think I knew somehow that I would come back to it eventually. And then in my early 20s, you know, my partner at the time was like, come to Swan shows, you're gonna love it. And I'm like, okay, sure. And I went, and yeah, I freaking loved it, and that really got me back into I was in a way like kind of getting back into organized noise and getting back into like just overwhelming music, sonically overwhelming music. And yeah, I think I've seen maybe 4 Swan shows since then, since like 2012 or something. And I was like, yeah, I understand intrinsically, like, this was not for me at the time, and I know exactly why, and there's no shame for me in that. And it's totally the time in which I found it was exactly when I needed to find it again. And yeah, I mean, dude's got his problems, things got their problems, but like, as far as the sound itself goes, I get it, and like it makes a lot of sense for me. And I was trying to think, like I said, I was trying to find the thing that represents aggression and heaviness and crushingness for this sort of set of albums for this podcast, and I couldn't do something that was like noisier. I still needed something that's like somewhat organized and still has like lyrical structure. And I guess that's still kind of how I am to a certain degree. I still need balance even when things are really, really heavy. So, yeah.
So you mentioned you wanted to bring something crushing to the table amongst these 3 releases. Why is that a big facet of your, I don't know, your interests in music? Like, what is it about that? You know, what's the allure there?
What is the allure there? It is, maybe it kind of goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about low frequencies and being in the body and even pressure. You know, having something force you into your body is both ecstatic and terrifying. Being confronted with like the smallness of your body, but also the bigness in which you feel it, really, really reinforces my sense of place in the world. Like, it's like having a weighted blanket. Like, like it's having a thunder shirt. Like, totally. You know, having thus now embarked on a trail of listening, of training my listening into a place of pretty high sensitivity, that can be
exhausting. And sometimes I need to be bludgeoned into smallness again, or into the ground or something. It like regrounds me. And yeah, I think like music, I mean, it's a very emotional medium, and the ways in which we perceive sound operates on us in so many ways, like that we can't even really articulate. I mean, especially with language. And so having something crushing in the face of like reality, which is crushing, capitalism, which is crushing, inequity, which is crushing, a pandemic, which is crushing.
Right.
Like you just, maybe it is time for a little bit of the homeopathic, like on like, to just ground us in where we actually are, which is real. So yeah, it's super important to me. It shows up in my work a lot, I think. And then sometimes when I listen back to things, I'm like, girl, that's not as heavy as you thought it was. Like you thought you were so hardcore, and here you are singing. So sometimes it's maybe in my head. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess it's hard, isn't it, when suddenly you're no longer in the emotional headspace that you were when generating it, and so there's like I don't know, maybe there's a weight that was there that then isn't there when you're sort of at a temporal distance from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's really, I mean, as a composer, yeah, there's still catharsis in composing. Yeah, that's still real. Maybe not for everyone, but it's still real for me, so.
Geneva, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for talking through your new record, 3 important records as well. It's been great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope I made some semblance of sense.
Plenty. Thank you, and to everyone listening, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.